Welcome back to Focal Point After Talk. This free for all Friday edition. 888-589-8840 is the number to call. It was interesting last night. I'm monitoring my Twitter feed, and it just starts lighting up with all these references to Ed Schultz. Now, some of you know who Ed Schultz is. He's got a program on MSNBC. And all of a sudden, all these people on my Twitter feed are talking about Ed Schultz and me, which was completely news to me. I had no idea that Ed Schultz and I were connected in any conceivable way. And so I went poking around this morning, and I found that Ed Schultz had devoted part of a segment to going after your humble host. This is clip one, Rob. This is Ed Schultz, MSNBC, from his program last night.
Tonight, manic regression, Bryan Fischer. The conservative radio host is giving us a different spin on Throwback Thursday. Fischer wants to kick voting rights back to the 19th century.
Back in the day, colonial period, you had to be a landowner, a property owner, to be eligible to vote. And I don't think that's a bad idea. And the reason was very simple. If somebody owns property in a community, they're vested in that community. People that are not property owners, it's like people that pay no taxes. They've got no skin in the game.
Oh, the idea of restricting the vote to property owners, I think it died around about the same time indoor plumbing caught on in this country. Coincidentally, Fischer's argument belongs, I think, in the toilet. This blast from the past doesn't come as a surprise from backwards Bryan.
If somebody wants to exercise political power, and he is an evolutionist, he is disqualified from holding political office in the United States of America. Realize that homosexuals cannot reproduce, so they have to recruit. Permits, in my judgment, should not be granted to build even one more mosque in the United States of America. What we need is about 150 million Phil Robertsons out there.
Bryan Fischer never let bigotry get in the way of running his mouth. But if he thinks those views will run the country, he can keep on pretending.
So that is Ed Schultz. This is your manically regressive host, Bryan Fischer. The comments I made about voting rights in the colonial era, that was just kind of off the cuff. It was actually in response to a phone call that I received talking with a caller, and it reminded me of that. It was just sort of a brief little excursus into that. But I did a little bit of poking around this morning in the wake of this Ed Schultz going after me. And here's a little bit of window of insight into how the founders looked at the voting issue, because I think this is actually pretty significant and pretty insightful on their part. I'm looking at a piece here, first of all, by Stephen Montgomery. This is back from 2003. But he quotes a couple of political philosophers, John Locke, first of all, who said this: "The great and chief end, therefore, of men's unity into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property." So life, liberty, and property, these are the three great rights that we have been given by God. Governments are there to secure them. This is what the founders believed, and they were influenced by John Locke. He wrote those words in 1690. Now, here's what John Adams said, founding father, third president of the United States. No, second president. "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is no force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence. Property must be secured or liberty cannot exist." Property must be secured or liberty cannot exist. So John Adams, and he's right about this, the right to property is as sacred a right as the right to life and the right to liberty. And we know that from the Ten Commandments. What is commandment number, I forget the exact order here, but commandment number 7, I believe, says thou shalt not murder. Or the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder. So there is the right to life. What's the next command? Thou shalt not steal. That is the right to private property. Now, you can't steal something unless it belongs to somebody. They've got private property rights over whatever you're taking from them. So we know that those two fundamental rights, life, liberty, or life and property, are enshrined in the Ten Commandments. These come from the very mind and heart and hand of God. And this is part of the reason that the founders reserved the franchise to property owners. And it's exactly what I said in that off-the-cuff thing. Since voters were also property owners, they would have a great vested interest in how government was run and operated and in keeping government fiscally restrained and responsible. That's exactly what I said. This is from the piece by Stephen Montgomery, but echoing the reason of the Founding Fathers to limit the franchise to property owners. They would be vested in the community, and they would be deeply concerned about the tax burden that everybody had to bear, especially property owners, deeply concerned about how public policies were affecting private property, affecting restrictions on private property, affecting the use of private property because it would impact them, because by purchasing property in that community, they were expressing a commitment to live in that community. Now, it would give an incentive to potential voters to acquire property. People would want to gain the right to vote. The way they do that is by purchasing property. So it would give them an incentive to make the decisions, to do the hard work that would be necessary to become landowners themselves so they could be part of the people that had the franchise and were able to direct public policy for that community. And property owners were generally seen as those who had worked hard and industriously, had exercised self-control and thrift, and acquired other virtuous character traits seen as necessary for the well-being of society. So if somebody owned property, it would be an indication, here's somebody that worked hard, they were industrious, they saved, they didn't waste their money, they saved it up so they could purchase property and maintain it and care for it. Now, James Madison, his idea was that you need to have two bodies, legislative bodies, one of whom is elected by property owners, which was the Senate in Massachusetts. This is the Massachusetts Constitution. And the other house would be elected by the general populace. So James Madison said, we need, in the interest of protecting private property, we need to have one half of this legislature be elected by property owners. Now, we know that property owners can oppress the poor. So let's have the other house elected by people that don't own property. So they've got a house that's going to represent them and protect them from oppression from the property owners. But he said we also have to protect the rights and the property of the property owners. Here's what Madison said in 1821. In a just and free government, therefore, the rights both of property and of persons ought to be effectually guarded. So you're talking about property, talking about persons. Both of them need to be protected. Will the former, that is those who own property and the rights of those who own property, will the former be protected, guarded in case of a universal and equal suffrage? Will the latter be so in the case of a suffrage confined to the holders of property? So it says, look, if everybody's got the vote, then it puts the private property rights of property owners at risk. But if only property owners have voting rights, then it puts the rights of the persons who don't have the vote at risk. So that's why one house for one house for the other. But he goes on to talk about the danger to the holders of property cannot be disguised if they be undefended against a majority without property. We must not, he says, shut our eyes to the nature of man, nor to the light of experience. Who would rely on a fair decision from three individuals if two had an interest in the case opposed to the rights of the third? And then one other thing, this is from his address to the Massachusetts Convention 1787, viewing the subject in its merits alone, well, this is at the Constitutional Convention, actually. Viewing the subject in its merits alone, the freeholders, that is, landowners of the country, would be the safest depositories of Republican liberty. In future times, the great majority of the people will not only be without landed, but any other sort of property. These will either combine under the influence of their common situation, in which case the rights of property and the public liberty will not be secure in their hands. So he says universal suffrage, that is, everybody votes, and you have a minority of the people in a society that are property owners, their property rights will not be safe. This is what John Tyler said back in 1770 in a book, Cycle of Democracy, Alexander Tyler. A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising them the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over a loose fiscal responsibility, always followed by a dictatorship. And you can see where we are right now. All right, well, let's go to the phones. Let's begin with Ann in Little Rock, Arkansas. Ann, welcome to Focal Point. What's on your mind? Number, by the way, is 888-589-8840 on Free for All Friday. Ann, go right ahead. You're on with Bryan Fischer.
Thank you, Brian. Just wanted to mention about immigration.
Yes,
Speaking
ma'am.
about that, there was a comment made following a press conference in 2007 where Condoleezza Rice and a representative from Mexico and government representative from Canada were trying to refute some information about this new superhighway system across the USA.
Mm-hmm.
And her comment was, well, we all occupy the same space.
That was Condoleezza Rice?
That was Condoleezza Rice on camera in that press conference, and that's what her response was to the kind of the what was being.
So basically,
talking about it.
So basically, she was kind of, in effect, dismissing the ideas of borders. We have to we have to get past the point where we're thinking about borders between nations. We all occupy the same space.
Exactly. That's exactly what they did, and that was brought about because President Bush and a representative from Canada and a government representative from Mexico signed a secret agreement in 2005 that lined these three countries up, and what's going to tie them all together is what they call the it's a superhighway system. It's going to begin.
That Texas corridor you're talking about. I'm aware of what you're talking about there, Ann. Well, listen, thank you for the call. You know what Ann has highlighted here, and Condoleezza Rice and George Bush, both of them, did not have a biblical worldview when it came to borders. Because notice what God says in the scriptures, that God is the one who has determined allotted periods, that is how long nations exist, how long they have power, how long their influence lasts. God determines that. And he determines the boundaries of their dwelling place. So God is the one who has determined the boundaries of the United States of America and entrusted the United States with the responsibility to protect, define, and defend those boundaries. Back in 2.